Okay, so you want to understand NATO expansion. Buckle up, because this is a deep dive into one of the most debated geopolitical issues of our time, and it's got more twists and turns than a spy novel.
Absolutely. And with the war in Ukraine raging on,
Hmm.
understanding NATO expansion is more crucial now than ever.
Right, so let's break it down for anyone who might be new to this whole thing. What exactly is NATO? I mean, what's its purpose? Why does it even exist?
Well, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed back in 1949. Basically, the whole idea was collective defense.
Collective defense.
Yeah, basically, if one member gets attacked, it's like all of them get attacked. They all jump in to protect each other, like a big protective shield over a group of countries.
Okay, makes sense. So during the Cold War, this shield was mainly pointed at containing the Soviet Union.
Exactly. That was
Yeah.
the primary focus back then.
But then the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. You'd think NATO's reason for existing would kind of disappear with it, wouldn't you?
You would think so, right? It seems logical. But instead of just calling it a day, NATO decided to stick around. And not only that, they started expanding.
And not just expanding in any random direction, they specifically started expanding eastward.
Right, towards Russia's borders.
And that's where things start to get a little bit complicated, a little bit messy, because a lot of people argue that this expansion was a direct threat to Russia, maybe even a betrayal of promises made after the Cold War ended. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a huge point of debate, and it's really at the heart of a lot of the tension we see today. On one hand, you have Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, saying that the West promised not to expand NATO 1 inch eastward.
1 inch eastward, huh? That's pretty clear.
It sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
But Western leaders interpret those discussions from back then differently. They say there weren't really any concrete promises made.
Hold on, so we're talking about verbal agreements here. Was there any official document or treaty or anything like that?
That's the thing, that there's no signed treaty specifically saying NATO won't expand.
So it's all based on interpretations of conversations and the overall political climate at the time. That seems like a recipe for misunderstandings and mistrust.
Exactly, and that's precisely what happened. Whether or not a promise was actually broken, the perception that one was broken has had a major impact on Russia's actions and foreign policy.
So let's unpack those early days of NATO expansion a bit. What exactly happened after the Soviet Union fell apart?
Well, the first wave of expansion happened in 1999 when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO.
Those were all former Warsaw Pact countries, right?
And again, they were all once aligned with the Soviet Union, so for them to switch sides and join NATO was a pretty big deal.
I can imagine that raised some eyebrows in Moscow.
It definitely did. And then in 2004, 7 more countries joined, including the Baltic states.
The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, those are the ones that share a border with Russia, right?
Exactly. So now NATO wasn't just some distant alliance. It was literally right on Russia's doorstep.
Okay. Yeah, I'm starting to see why Russia might have felt a little uneasy about all of this. It's one thing to have a rival alliance somewhere far away, but to have them right next door, that's a whole different ballgame.
It's a huge difference. And to really understand why this was so unsettling for Russia, we have to consider their history.
History always plays a role, doesn't it?
Always. And in Russia's case, they've been invaded from the West multiple times throughout their history. Napoleon, World War I, Hitler's invasion in World War II. These aren't just stories in history books. For them, it's a deep-seated national trauma.
So every time NATO gets a little bit closer to their border, it brings back all those memories and anxieties. It's like a ghost from the past coming back to haunt them.
That's a really good way to put it. And this fear of encirclement, coupled with the belief that the West had broken its promises, created this perfect storm of suspicion and resentment that's been brewing for decades.
And that brings us to Ukraine, doesn't it? Because we can't talk about NATO expansion without talking about Ukraine and its unique position in all of this.
Absolutely. Ukraine is right in the middle of this geopolitical tug of war. And to understand why this is such a flashpoint, we need to look at its historical ties to both Russia and Europe.
So what's the background there? Why is Ukraine so important to Russia?
Well, for starters, Ukraine and Russia share deep cultural, linguistic, and historical connections. They were both part of the Soviet Union, and for a long time, Russia viewed Ukraine almost as an extension of itself.
So there's that shared history, but what about strategically?
Strategically, Russia sees Ukraine as a crucial buffer zone, a kind of protective barrier between itself and the West. But here's where things get interesting. Ukraine also has strong European aspirations, particularly among its younger generations. A lot of Ukrainians are drawn to democratic values, and they want closer ties to the European Union.
So it's like Ukraine is caught between these two powerful forces, each pulling them in a different direction, like being in a family with divorced parents who both want custody.
That's a great analogy. And this internal struggle within Ukraine,
Yeah.
this pull between East and West, really came to a head in 2014 with the Euromaidan protests.
The Euromaidan protests. Remind us what those were all about.
They were massive pro-European demonstrations that took place in Kyiv.
And what triggered them.
They were sparked by the then-president Viktor Yanukovych. He decided to back out of a deal that would have brought Ukraine closer to the European Union and instead chose to strengthen ties with Russia.
And from Russia's perspective, did this look like the West meddling in their affairs, trying to pull Ukraine away from them?
That's exactly how they saw it. They viewed the protests, which eventually led to Yanukovych being ousted, as a Western-backed coup, an attempt to install a pro-Western government in Ukraine and push Russia out.
And how did Russia respond to all of this?
Well, they responded pretty decisively with two major actions. First, they annexed the Crimean Peninsula.
Crimea, that was part of Ukraine, right?
Yeah, it was Ukrainian territory, but with a majority Russian population. And at the same time, they started actively supporting separatist movements in eastern Ukraine.
So that's where the conflict in eastern Ukraine that we've been hearing so much about really kicked off.
Exactly. It's been simmering ever since.
And all of this was happening while the debate over NATO expansion was still raging on. I can only imagine how these events in Ukraine just poured fuel on the fire.
It absolutely did. The annexation of Crimea, the conflict in eastern Ukraine, these were all seen in Moscow as proof that the West was actively trying to weaken Russia and pull Ukraine into its orbit.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? The more Russia tried to prevent NATO expansion, the more it pushed Ukraine and other countries away. Just a vicious cycle of mistrust and escalation.
Exactly. And unfortunately, this all set the stage for the events of 2022, which took this tension to a whole new level.
All right, so let's talk about the 2022 invasion. What exactly happened and what reasons did Putin give for it?
Well, on February 24th, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Putin's main justification was that NATO expansion and the possibility of Ukraine joining the alliance posed an existential threat to Russia's security.
But Ukraine wasn't actually a member of NATO at that point, right?
Correct. Not officially. But they were receiving a lot of military aid and training from NATO countries. And in Putin's eyes, this is a clear sign that Ukraine was moving closer and closer to the West.
So he felt like he had to act quickly and decisively to stop that from happening.
That was his rationale.
So NATO was in a tough spot. They were supporting Ukraine, but also trying to avoid getting directly involved in a conflict with Russia. Sounds like they were walking a tightrope. How did they respond to the invasion?
NATO responded with a multi-pronged approach. Basically, they wanted to support Ukraine, but also contain the conflict and prevent it from turning into a wider war. They focused on four main things.
Okay, I'm really curious to hear what those four things were. What did they involve?
First, they significantly increased military aid to Ukraine. We're talking billions of dollars worth of weapons, ammunition, and intelligence support.
So they weren't directly involved in the fighting, but they were giving the Ukrainians the tools to defend themselves.
Exactly. It was a way to support Ukraine without putting NATO boots on the ground.
What else did they do?
The second big thing was economic sanctions. NATO members, along with other Western countries, imposed some really harsh sanctions on Russia, targeting their financial system, their energy sector, and even specific individuals.
Basically trying to squeeze them economically to make it harder for them to keep the war going.
Right. The sanctions were all about applying pressure without direct military action. And that pushes us to the third point. NATO also beefed up its troop deployments in Eastern Europe, particularly in countries bordering Russia and Ukraine.
So they were bolstering their defenses, sending a message of solidarity, but still trying to avoid a direct confrontation with Russia.
Exactly. It was a delicate balancing act, trying to project strength and deter further aggression without escalating the situation.
And then there's this whole debate about a proxy war.
Yeah, that's the fourth and probably most controversial aspect of NATO's response.
Because while NATO insists that it's not directly involved in the fighting, some people argue that the level of support they're giving Ukraine is basically the same thing as being directly involved.
It's a murky area, for sure. They're providing weapons, intelligence training, logistical support, all sorts of things. So it's not a declared war, but the West is definitely playing a huge role in shaping the conflict.
It's a really complex situation, and there are no easy answers. But let's zoom out for a second and think about the bigger picture. How has all of this NATO expansion, the war in Ukraine, the West's response. How has it all affected Russia's security? How do they see it?
From Russia's point of view, it's been pretty disastrous. They feel increasingly surrounded by NATO, like they're being boxed in. All those historical fears about invasion from the West, they're all coming back with a vengeance.
So it's not just about abstract security concerns for them. It's about very real and deep-seated anxieties rooted in their history.
Absolutely. And on top of that, they're also losing influence in what they used to consider their own backyard. Former Soviet republics like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, they're all drifting towards the West, towards NATO.
So they're facing this two-pronged challenge, NATO expanding closer and closer, and at the same time, their own sphere of influence is shrinking. How have they reacted to all of this?
Well, if you look at their actions, they've responded with a classic show of force.
Hmm.
Like they're saying, we're not backing down, we're not going to be ignored. They've been building up their military along their western border, modernizing their armed forces, and expanding their nuclear arsenal.
It sounds like a very dangerous game of chicken. And
Yeah.
then, of course, we can't forget about Finland and Sweden. They both applied for NATO membership in 2023, and that was a direct response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right?
You got it. There's
Yeah.
a huge turning point, a real shift in the security landscape of Europe. Finland and Sweden had stayed neutral for decades, but the war in Ukraine completely changed their calculus.
And Finland has already officially joined NATO, so now the alliance's border with Russia is twice as long as it used to be.
That's right. And it just goes to show how much Russia's actions have backfired. Instead of pushing NATO away, they've actually driven more countries straight into its arms. It's a classic case of unintended consequences.
So where do we go from here? What are the possible scenarios for the future? Are we headed for a new Cold War?
Nobody knows for sure, but we could look at some potential paths this could take, each with its own risks and implications. It's kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure story, except the stakes are incredibly high.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's explore those potential scenarios.
One possibility is a prolonged stalemate in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Imagine a war that just drags on for years and years, neither side able to win decisively.
War of attrition, basically, just grinding away with no end in sight. That sounds awful.
It would be devastating.
Yeah.
For Ukraine, for Russia, for the entire region, and for the world, we'd be looking at a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions, economic turmoil, political instability, the whole nine yards. It's a scenario that nobody wants,
Yeah.
but it's definitely a possibility.
So a stalemate is one option. What else could happen? Is there any chance of a peaceful resolution?
Another possibility is a negotiated settlement, but that would require some pretty big compromises from both sides. Imagine Ukraine agreeing to neutrality, meaning they wouldn't join NATO, but they would also get security guarantees from both Russia and the West.
So they would become this kind of buffer zone, a neutral state with international safeguards to protect their sovereignty. But that would be a tough sell for Ukraine, wouldn't it? Especially after everything they've been through.
It would be a hard pill to swallow for sure. They'd be giving up on their dreams of joining NATO, and they'd have to trust that those security guarantees would actually hold up, which is, a bit of a gamble. Considering recent events, it would be a delicate balancing act, and whether it's even possible depends on a whole bunch of factors. The willingness of both sides to compromise the level of trust or mistrust between them, the overall geopolitical climate. It's a long shot, but it's not completely out of the question.
It sounds like finding that middle ground would be incredibly difficult. What about the possibility of NATO just continuing to expand? Could that happen even with all the risks involved?
It's not impossible, but it would be extremely risky. Imagine a scenario where NATO just keeps expanding, adding more and more countries, maybe even Ukraine and Georgia, despite Russia's objections. That would be a huge red line for Russia.
They've made it pretty clear that they see NATO expansion as an existential threat.
Exactly. So if NATO keeps pushing eastward, it could trigger a massive military buildup from Russia and escalate tensions to the point of no return. We could be looking at a full-blown arms race, proxy wars, cyber attacks, all sorts of nasty stuff.
And that leads us to the worst case scenario, the new Cold War that everyone's been talking about.
Right. Imagine a world divided once again into two opposing blocs, NATO and its allies versus Russia and its partners. It would be a return to the kind of global instability and constant threat of nuclear war that we thought we'd left behind in the 20th century.
It's a chilling thought. So we've got these four main scenarios: a prolonged stalemate, a negotiated settlement, continued NATO expansion, and a new Cold War. Which one do you think is most likely?
Honestly, it's impossible to say for sure. There are so many variables at play, so many unknowns. It's like trying to predict the weather months in advance. The situation is constantly evolving, and any number of things could happen to change the course of events.
So all we can do is watch and wait and hope for the best. But it's important to remember that this isn't just some abstract geopolitical drama playing out on a map. This is a conflict with very real human consequences.
Exactly. We're talking about millions of people whose lives have been turned upside down by the war in Ukraine. People who have lost loved ones, lost their homes, lost their livelihoods, and the ripple effects are being felt all over the world.
We're seeing the impacts in terms of energy prices, food shortages, economic instability, and the list goes on. It's a global crisis.
And beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis, this war is also reshaping the entire global order. It's forcing us to rethink our assumptions about security, about international relations, about the future of democracy.
So this isn't just about borders and alliances. It's about the kind of world we want to live in, the values we want to uphold. And even though it all seems incredibly complex and overwhelming, we can't afford to just sit back and watch it all unfold passively.
You're absolutely right. We all have a role to play in this. We need to stay informed, we need to engage in thoughtful discussions about these issues, and we need to hold our leaders accountable for pursuing policies that prioritize peace and diplomacy.
So what can we as individuals do to make a difference in all of this?
Well, for one thing, we can stay informed. We can educate ourselves about the complexities of this conflict and the different perspectives involved.
And we can talk about it. We can have open and honest conversations with our friends and family, with our colleagues. We can share what we're learning, challenge each other's assumptions, and try to find common ground.
Exactly. And we can make our voices heard. We can contact our elected officials, let them know that we care about these issues and that we want them to prioritize peace and diplomacy in their decision-making.
We can support organizations that are working to help those affected by the conflict, provide humanitarian aid, promote peace building, and conflict resolution. There are so many ways to get involved, even if it feels like a drop in the ocean. Every little bit helps.
It all adds up. And maybe most importantly, we can try to cultivate empathy. It's easy to get caught up in the us versus them mentality, but at the end of the day, we're all human beings sharing this planet. We need to remember that the people on the other side of this conflict are just like us. They have families, they have hopes and dreams, they have fears and anxieties.
It's so easy to dehumanize the other side, especially when we're bombarded with so much propaganda and misinformation. But if we can step back and see each other as human beings, it makes it a lot harder to justify violence and aggression. It opens the door for dialogue, for understanding, for compassion.
It's the only way forward, really. Because the alternative, a world consumed by conflict and division, is just too terrifying to contemplate.
You know, one thing that's been really striking to me throughout this deep dive is how much history matters, how the events of the past continue to shape the present and the future.
It's like those historical echoes keep reverberating through time, influencing our perceptions, our decisions, our actions.
Like with Russia's historical anxieties about invasion from the West. Those fears are deeply rooted in their past experiences, and they're a major driving force behind their actions today.
And it's not just Russia. Every country, every culture, every individual is carrying around this baggage of history. And it's so important to be aware of that, to understand how those historical experiences shape our worldview, our biases, our interpretations of events.
Because if we don't acknowledge that historical baggage, we're doomed to keep repeating the same mistakes. We'll keep getting caught in those cycles of mistrust and conflict.
It's like we're all trapped in this giant web of history. And it's up to us to find a way to untangle it, to break free from those patterns of the past and create a new future.
It's a daunting task, but I think it's also an incredibly inspiring one. Because it
Yeah.
means that we have the power to change the course of history. We're not just passive bystanders. We're active participants in shaping the world around us.
And that's a huge responsibility, but it's also an incredible opportunity. Because it means that we can learn from the mistakes of the past, we can build on the successes, and we can create a world that's more peaceful, more just, and more sustainable for everyone.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. This whole deep dive into NATO expansion has been eye-opening, challenging, and ultimately hopeful. It's a reminder that even the most complex and intractable problems can be addressed if we approach them with curiosity, empathy, and a willingness to learn from each other.
It's been a privilege to share this journey with you, and I hope our listeners will continue to explore these issues, engage in meaningful conversations, and work towards a future where peace and cooperation prevail. Because ultimately, our shared humanity is far more powerful than any of the forces that seek to divide us.